Thank you so much for having me here today. For those of you who I haven't presented to before, there's going to be lots of data on the screen, of which I will probably reference very little of it as I tell you a story about Springfield and about the economy. So treat it somewhat as interesting visuals for the story that I'm about to tell you. I have had the privilege of working in, with and around Springfield now for the best part of the last 15 years, and as a nationally focused economics practice, having the experience of working with Springfield during its formative economic phase has been incredibly insightful and interesting when we've gone around the country and shared those insights with other parts of the nation. The story of Springfield is one that is eagerly consumed by other parts of the country because it's a story of a place that has been developed and established and grown by design and by intention, where so many places that we have in this country evolve out of a happenstance or an accident of fate, and lack that understanding and vision of what a place can be. And don't underestimate the importance of a vision and a direction when it comes to the underlying economic dynamism and resilience of a location. Resilience and dynamism together equal prosperity that is sustainable. And if you don't have that vision for a place, then what you get is volatility. What you get is an exposure and a risk of exposure to shocks that are outside of your control. And the story of Springfield, which I'll talk through today, and is really a story of growth in spite of trends, or growth in spite of what's happening around the country and around the world. Because when we talk about local economic development, it's important to understand that this needs to be considered within the context of what is happening in the state and what is happening in the country and around the world, for a couple of reasons. Just because you're in Springfield does not mean that you just do work in Springfield. There's that old adage of do you have a business in do you do business in Springfield, or do you do business from Springfield? They're two very different models of business, and the latter, with digital technologies and the internet and e-commerce, doing business from a place to around the world is a very viable opportunity now than it was in the past. So even though you're in a location, that doesn't mean that you are protected from what's happening around the world. Similarly, if you're in a situation of where your growth that's happening in your environment or in your local economy, you might be experiencing pretty solid growth, but if places around you or near you are growing even faster, 10, 15 years time, you might find yourself well behind the 8 ball. On the flip side, if you're going really strong and the rest of the environment that you're in, the rest of the region you're in is doing it tough, and you're still going strong, that means you're succeeding in spite of the environment that you're in. And that in some case has been the story of Springfield in this sort of post-pandemic environment. Because if we look at the national and economic trends, particularly particularly when it comes to the Australian economic story post-COVID, and particularly when we look at in terms of GDP per capita, it's been the story of a somewhat flat, if not somewhat slightly negative economic conditions since sort of 2022. There's estimates that the household sector in Australia has been in recession for 9 of the last 12 quarters. And that on a per capita basis, accounting not just for the population growth, but for the growth of the economy, that we really haven't gone anywhere much since the COVID period. Part of that is because we're victims of our success. Other parts of the world really tanked during COVID and absolutely fell off a cliff, and so got that massive sugar hit of recovery when they rebounded so significantly. And the fact that we were able to keep things going and prolonging for as long as possible is actually a part of the reason why we've had this sort of slow tail. Another part of this is that when governments intervene into crises, it doesn't reduce the total impact of the crises, it just spreads it out. And that's a really important social and economic thing to do, because it removes a crisis from being a shock to an impacted downturn. And that's part of what we've seen. And the success of Australia's economic policy has been that we took an unbelievably catastrophic shock and we turned it into a prolonged period of suboptimal growth, but that was still growing in the economy as a whole, even though we haven't felt it at a per person basis because of the per capita environment. What that's meant is that other parts of the world are starting to have taken off in the last 2 or 3 years in a much more robust way, whereas Australia has been somewhat left behind. The fortunate thing is the forecast and all the leading indicators are that the projections are expecting to see Australia's economic activity recover and improve over the next 3 to 5 years. But unlike other periods of time, maybe periods of time back to 2016 would be the most common period of time that we can point to, there's a lot of shocks in the economy that we need to be aware of and risks to the economy at a global level. There's a lot more volatility, which means projecting forward into the future is going to be more and more difficult to do. And so when we compare us to other parts of the world, you can see that the slowing in the US is expected to happen. We've already started to see a significant downturn in a number of the economic indicators in the US and the labour force, inflation and in other, and investment and economic expectations. And that's expected to see the US come off in terms of its economic activity, while Australia there starts to improve. However, we're still sitting well below the OECD average, which is where we sat with at most of the 15 years prior to COVID, was at or around the OECD average. So even though it's recovering, and we're expecting it to recover in the medium term, notwithstanding current and present headwinds, the Australian economy is going to continue to operate below where its capacity is in the short to medium term. And a big reason for that is that monetary policy has had an excessively constraining effect on the Australian economy now for the best part of the last 18 months to 2 years. We will probably drop below the 2% band for CPI in the next couple of quarters, which is a sign that the RBA was probably about 50 to 75 basis points behind where they should be in the easing cycle. We've had probably one of the most the strangest experiences recently, where we had full market consensus of a cut and then no cut, after the previous rate cutting cycle pointed to potentially 50 basis points instead of the 25 that actually occurred. We've never seen that divergence between what the market is seeing the data say and then what the interpretation of that information from an RBA perspective is. And part of the challenge is that monetary policy doesn't work the way it used to. It used to be that you increase your interest rates, and that pulls money out of the economy, out of the population, out of the household sector of the economy pretty uniformly. It doesn't do that anymore. What happens when you increase interest rates is that anybody who's on a fixed income interest-bearing account, i.e. those people who have retired and are out of the workforce, which is the largest generation, being the baby boomers, actually increase expenditure. During the most recent rate rise cycle, boomer household expenditure went up by 400%. While Gen X, Gen Y and Millennial and Gen Z expenditure dropped 20%. So you wonder why inflation is sticky. It's because there's a part of the household sector that actually spends more, and spends more at a higher propensity than what was happening than other generations. And in fact, that's part of the reason that it's come off. That's part of the reason we've had inflation so sticky for so long compared to other parts of the world, where the generational mix in terms of assets and wealth inequality is nowhere near as stark as it is here in Australia. So I point that out because there are fundamental structural challenges that the Australian economy has that we're working through at the moment, and those are being borne out by some of the indicators that we're seeing. What is interesting is that just because one of those structural challenges is that around the issue of ageing. At the moment, because we've seen a depression in the private sector economic activity, in part because of the inflationary environment, in part because of the uncertainty, that has led to a shift and a focus on effectively the government using fiscal policy to counter monetary policy. That's effectively what's happening, is that the government is spending more money to basically supersede and exceed the constraining impact of monetary policy, because it's an independent monetary policy in Australia. And unfortunately, we are at the wrong settings. And so the government is having to effectively overspend to counter monetary policy at the moment. So that is a huge part of it. But there is an underlying structural element to this as well, which is the fact that a big driver of the government's expenditure at a state and federal level is linked to the ageing of the population and the increase in the services that are being drawn down from that. And that disproportionately sits with the feds through spending around NDIS, also around spending through the health system, but also with the states as well. And so as we look at that public sector, as we look at how that translates then to the state, Queensland itself has actually done pretty well in the last sort of 3 years compared to the rest of the country. The growth has actually been stronger and significantly stronger than other parts of the country in the most recent period of time, in part because as successful as Australia was relative to our global peers in COVID, Queensland knocked it out of the park when it came to the economic certainty that the COVID management provided. And that's driven significant population growth, it's driven significant inward investment, and Queensland being seen as a destination of choice for investment and skills attraction because of the security and certainty of the response, but also because of the culture. The culture of, in a crisis, we rally together. And in an environment going forward where there are more and more crises, that culture is incredibly attractive to people around the country and around the world. We're seeing a dip-off in growth expected to occur in the 2026-27 year in Queensland, but that is in part leading the larger expenditure pool that's expected to come onto the market and come into the economy from the Olympics and the first budget tranche that was announced in the most recent budget, where we're seeing half the allocation the next 4 years for the stadium. We're seeing other secondary venue expenditure being allocated, as well as some of the athletes' villages as well. So we're going to see that sugar hit into the economy, but also as a result of that, we're going to see significant constraints into a number of sectors, particularly as it relates to construction, start to flow into the economy. So we're going to be in a very classic, almost overheating type of economic environment in Queensland for a while, because of the impact that the capital expenditure from the Olympics is going to have into the environment. But that is going to keep Queensland's economic activity well above the national average going forward into the future. So a combination of sort of structural and systemic positives in Queensland compared to the nation, but also in the forward next 5 to 10 years, the impact of the Olympics and what that's going to have in terms of the expenditure going into the economy. So that's a snapshot of the environment that Springfield finds itself. And it's interesting when we look at Springfield because when we do these types of presentations, it very much could be seen as a tale of two economies. There's a national and state economy, and then there's a Springfield economy. And that's a really interesting insight when we look at a local area, is how linked to those national and state trends is a local area. And the short answer is not very linked. Springfield's at a fundamental level is being driven by and has historically been driven by the establishment phase of a highly economically engaged, higher aspirational, younger population that has seen it rise to 50,000 in the project area, 175,000 in the direct catchment, 500,000 in the wider catchment, and that is expected to continue to grow into the medium term with populations approaching 100,000 in the project area and 500,000 with areas like Ripley Valley and Flagstone and Yarrabilba in a very close proximity to the area here. What is very unique in Springfield, which we don't see elsewhere, is the fact that the area is expected to remain perennially young. The population at the moment over the 65 is about 5% of the population. It's expected to get to about 10% of the population at a time when in some locations 1 in 4 people will be aged 65 and over in other locations around the country. So it's a complete decoupling of the age profile of the area compared to its peers in some other parts of the local government, but particularly when we look at other parts of the state where we're seeing a much more rapid aging of the population. What that means is that we have a larger proportion of the population that is young, accessing schools, transitioning into tertiary studies and other training and employment, but we're also seeing working age families in the area, both locally and in the surrounding area as well. And that's really important because we all know now in this room how hard it is to get staff. And in most parts around the country, that's going to get much, much worse. Labour force constraint is the single biggest constraint on the economy in the structural term. We're now reaching points where median ages of workforces in certain industries are in their high 50s. The construction just hit 56 years. Nursing is around 47 years. These are sectors that are incredibly important, but have age profiles in their workforce that exceed that of the country, and those are critical sectors in terms of our future delivery of opportunities and the realisation of economic potential. So Springfield is not that story. Springfield is a story of worker access and of economically active people. And you can see that through both the incomes in the region being higher And that isn't a wealth translation as much as it is an economic participation translation. There are more people working. Female workforce participation in Springfield is one of the highest in the state. People are working. Some of that is because it's also an expensive place and an aspirational place to live. And so there is a requirement or a desire or a need for people to work. But the other thing is we have incredibly high levels of post-secondary and particularly university levels of skills and tertiary education. And as you can see, structurally low unemployment that has been below that of the state average and the national averages now for pretty consistently the best part of 20 years. Unemployment rate has been below 3% for all the three statistical areas that comprise the project area. And in the middle of the COVID boom, it went up to about 6% and then dropped back down to 3% after one quarter. That's a sign of resilience. If you get hit by a once-in-a-century crisis and your unemployment rate goes from 3% to 6% and back down to 3% in the space of 6 months, you're fine. There are places who are still recovering now from the structural impact that the COVID had when it came to their labour forces. Here, it was literally a statistical blip. And that is a very unique aspect of Springfield. But what it means, though, is that as much as you have an economically engaged population and at high levels of participation, low unemployment means it's also harder to get workforce locally because it's such a competitive labour market. But that's part of the drivers of Springfield, and which we'll talk about in a minute, which is Springfield is not just a place to do business in, but to do business from. And that's increasingly what we're seeing when it comes to labour force access. I mentioned before the skills and the skills population of where 40% of the population has a post-school tertiary level university or bachelor level qualification compared to 35% across the state. So it is a hub of skilled people. And the number of people in skilled occupations is expected to more than double over the course of the next 15 years as that intensification of the skilled labour market within the area is expected to become even more intense and even more concentrated, supporting higher value-adding industries and businesses who are looking for high-skilled people to support transitions into AI, transitions into national and international markets where higher skilled and higher educated staff is required. The story of Springfield then is a story that has leveraged in terms of the business community, that has leveraged some of those population, those skills, that economic participation drivers of the population and the demographics, to the point where we've seen 1,000 new small businesses or locally registered businesses created within Springfield over the last 4 years. That's a 50% increase. So as much as the population in the area has been growing 6% year on year for as long as we can go back and get data for, the business community in Springfield is growing at double that, more than double that. And in fact, that is actually part of the story that we're seeing in Springfield now, which is it is reaching a point where the economy in Springfield is outpacing its population. That it's moving into a cycle where Springfield's growth now and into the future is a business and industry-led growth rather than a population-led growth. That's awesome, because there are many places we can point to around the state that can look at that growth profile, and when the population ends, so too does the local economy. And in fact, it often will start going backwards. Springfield is already demonstrating that the opposite is happening, that the business and industry sector is actually accelerating faster and out further into the future at a faster rate than what the population is expected to continue to grow. And part of that is because there are businesses here that are doing business from Springfield rather than just in Springfield. When we look at those business registrations on a per capita basis, you can see that impact that population growth has had, and where there are now 50 businesses, almost 50 businesses for every 1,000 people that live in Springfield. And they're just locally registered businesses with their HQ or their business address here in Springfield. That doesn't include your Woolies, that doesn't include anywhere that the business is located or registered elsewhere. That's just people who have their registered address here in Springfield. And you can see how that's grown consistently across the project area as well. It's not just a sign of individual areas or individual pockets. There's been significant growth across the entire project area. What we've also seen is growth in all the different business sizes. So everything from non-employing businesses, which have grown significantly, all the way through to the largest businesses have all experienced positive growth. So we haven't seen, as we've seen in some other areas, just a bump because people have post-COVID have gone and bought their own job, set up their ABN and are just contracting out. There's actually people who have done that, but then have grown and started to put on staff, or businesses that already had 1 or 2 that now have 5 or 6, me being one of them. When we see that consistent growth across all the different business sizes, that's a sign of an underlying structural advantage that the local economy has. It's not one type of business size trading off against one another. That's in each individual category. That's every single category leveraging from the same significant underpinning drivers. And the same thing we can see then when we look at the industry breakdown and how they've grown over the last 20 years in terms of the last 4 years since 2020 for the business community. And where we see sectors such as health, education, transport, construction, retail trade, the big ones, professional services and healthcare. Really, really big private sector growth. And this, of course, is business registrations. So these are businesses, private businesses in these sectors. This doesn't include the government funded activities and businesses that are located here, not just businesses that are operating here. So when we're seeing this diversity of the type of businesses that are growing in terms of size, this diversity of the sectors of the businesses that are growing across the economy, that tells you that there are fundamental underlying trends about the Springfield story and its economic opportunities that are systemic, structural and widespread that a range of different businesses and sectors are taking advantage of. And that is a critical element to the resilience of local economies into the future. How many pillars is your economy built on? I have the privilege of working across the country, and there are a lot of places that have one pillar, and that pillar is about to be pulled out from underneath the economy in the next 5 to 10 years. And they're dealing with fundamentally existential crises around the existence of their locations, of their communities into the future. Springfield has an abundance of pillars. And so if one of those pillars weakens because of factors outside of your control, a shock or something like that, there are so many other pillars to be leaning upon. And the fact that we can point to this now is saying that unlike the rest of the economy, which has been growing slower than the population growth rate, the economy here has been growing double that of the population growth rate, and the population growth rate itself is 3 times more than the national average. That's a very unique set of economic drivers and environment to be in. So to do business from Springfield rather than just in Springfield requires a recognition of the fact that the boundary of what we call Springfield is an arbitrary one from an economic perspective. What we call Ipswich, what we call Southeast Queensland, they're just administrative or ownership boundaries. That's not how the economy works. The economy moves beyond those boundaries freely and easily, and part of the reason for they are able to do that is that Springfield exists within a wider network of activity centres, a wider network of economic clusters, and the trading that's happening within and between those clusters is a critical aspect of Springfield's economic potential. As a principal activity centre, Springfield is designated and set up for 500,000 people servicing. Even at the project, when it hits 100,000 people, that means 4 in 5 of the people linked to the economic activity here are not going to be living here. They're going to be living in the catchment around it. At the moment, it's 1 in 3, and soon it'll be 1 in 5. So despite all that growth I just told you about how fast the Springfield economy is growing, how diverse it is, how robust it is, the local population, local economic activity is actually going to get a smaller share of the total drivers compared to the surrounding catchment. This is a story of a centre servicing 500,000 population or more in the surrounding community. That's why we're seeing businesses who are coming in to Springfield, not just to trade into Springfield, but to use it as a network approach, a hub and spoke approach, to set up a hub here in Springfield, but then also to service into surrounding areas, into Ripley, out to Greenbank, into southern parts of Brisbane. Why? Because all roads lead to Springfield. Maha, you've heard many times before, have made this comment about the fact that the position here at Springfield was not by accident. The roads going north, south, east and west was not by accident. That was by design. And this is the fruits of that design coming by, which is the fact that you have a 360-degree catchment to trade into. The other thing we're seeing that in the way that's sort of being borne out is by the profile of expenditure and investment that's going into the economy. We've seen significant investment, and you can see there the big yellow line that's gone up at Springfield Lakes with the approval of the hospital, the stage 2 of the hospital that's going in at the moment. That's going to add 1,000 medical jobs. 1,000 medical jobs once it's opened, above and beyond what it currently has there at the hospital precinct. There's 12,500 jobs in Springfield at the moment. So, and it's going to add another 1,000. So 8% more jobs from one project once it's operational. The scale of some of the investment that's going into Springfield, despite the size and the depth of the Springfield economy, these are massive hits, structural changes to the economy that's going to be driving investment. And it's also an indication and a heralding to the wider economy, wider investment community around the country that this is a place to do business and a place to invest in. And so what that means in terms of Springfield is that the role of Springfield and the drivers of Springfield are changing. The population-led focus of Springfield to date has well and truly moved into a secondary position relative to the growth of the business community and the growth of industry and investment. This is a place where businesses do business not just in Springfield, but from Springfield, and recognising that accessibility to and from other parts of southeast Queensland, the role of digital technologies to be able to trade globally seamlessly, and the role of the transport network to integrate in with a rapidly growing population base in the surrounding area. All of those things are combining together to drive the economy of Springfield faster than that of the population. But a big part of that, and a big part of the growth of a local economy, from my experience looking across the country, is culture. There was some great work that was done by the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics about 15 years ago, looking at the impact of droughts on farms. And they looked at how farming impacts, a drought would affect a farming region and what that would do in terms of farm closures. And they looked at all the major droughts, and they looked at all the elements around the economics and the commodities and all those types of things to determine what determined whether a farm would fail or not. And in the end, their conclusion was it had nothing to do with the resources, it had nothing to do with the environment or the drought impact, it had everything to do with the business culture of the farm. It was culture. And when you take that example and you blow it up to a place as big as Springfield and show what that looks like, do not underestimate what an entrepreneurial, dynamic and resilient economic culture means in terms of the stability and prosperity and opportunities of a local economy into the future. There are amazing places around the world and around the country that should not be as good as they are, but are because of the culture of the place in terms of their wanting to give it a go, supporting each other, making investments, leading from the front. Those elements of culture underpin those drivers and make those drivers real. Because you have to put in efforts to make these drivers and these potential real. And that is something that, for the history of the Springfield project, and particularly the last 5 years we've seen, is the business community within Springfield step up and make that potential real. So going forward, with more constraints and more volatility, but also more opportunity, the impetus then becomes to the business community is, how do you continue to do that? How do you continue to maintain a culture that is focused on making the opportunities of Springfield, the potential of Springfield, real now and into the future? Thank you very much.